How do we get data into MarkLogic? We know MarkLogic can do great things once we have some data to work with, but we often need to load it from a variety of sources on an ongoing basis. At 4V Services, we typically use Apache NiFi to address this problem. I'm Dave Castle, founder of 4V Services. In this series of videos, we're going to go over the essential things you need to know to use NiFi to get data into MarkLogic. Apache NiFi is a data orchestration tool. We can use it to pull data from sources, execute some types of transforms, load it into MarkLogic, and instruct MarkLogic to do additional work with it. We can do this with a flexible scheduling mechanism. NiFi has a robust queuing system for data, so we don't need to worry about the application losing data. Let's get started. I'm going to set up a Docker container with NiFi to talk to an existing Docker container that's already running MarkLogic. You might set them both up at the same time using Docker Compose, but I'm going to use them separately for now. In order to create my Docker container, I'll use a Docker command to create a new container called NiFi demo. I'll specify the version of NiFi that I want to work with. I'll give it the initial username and password. So I'm just doing a simple single user here. Note that there are some complexity requirements for the password, so we have to have it have a certain length, for example. I'm using port 8443. HTTPS is active by default. I'll run that command, and it'll take a minute or two for NiFi to get going and be fully available. We've given NiFi a minute to get started, so we can go to the pointer browser to the user interface, HTTPS localhost :8443, that's the port that I set up the container to work with, /NiFi. When I go here, I get this warning about the certificate just because it's localhost. I'm going to skip past that for my local development purposes. I'm going to log in with the admin password that I had established. And this takes me to a clean instance of NiFi. What we're looking at here is called the canvas. That's the background. Across the top, I've got my toolbar with various kinds of components that I can drag onto the canvas. There's an information bar and some navigation tools. We'll look at all these in more detail as we go. First thing I'll note is that when we hover over the processor icon, we can drag that onto the canvas, and that's how we'll add processors into a NiFi flow. We can filter, and the first thing I'm going to note is that if I filter from MarkLogic, we don't have anything yet. We have not installed the NiFi processors. To do that, I'm going to go to github.com/marklogic/NiFi/releases. At the time of this recording, the latest release is 1.16.3.2. This release addresses a number of important bugs. If you're using an earlier release, I encourage you to upgrade to this one. For any release, there are two important files to download, these two NAR files here. So the NiFi MarkLogic NAR and the NiFi MarkLogic Services NAR will give us the MarkLogic pieces we need to work with. I've already downloaded these, so my next step is to copy them into the NiFi container. In NiFi, there is an extensions directory which allows NiFi to dynamically load new components. NiFi is typically installed in the opt directory. And we can see here that there's a NiFi current directory. Inside of NiFi current, we see the extensions directory. So that's where I'm going to copy my files. So I'm going to do a docker cp, and I have downloaded these into my software/MarkLogic. So opt, yep, NiFi demo opt NiFi current extensions. I'll do the same thing for the services nar file. So NiFi will poll that directory and periodically take a look to see what new files have become available. When it sees something, it will read them and make those available in the user interface. After NiFi has read in those new nar files, we can go back to the user interface and confirm that we can see them. We'll need to refresh the user interface so that NiFi will get the latest list. So now again, I'm going to drag the processor icon onto the canvas and filter for MarkLogic. And now we can see I've got a whole set of MarkLogic NARs available. We're going to start off by building a simple flow that I actually tend to build in all of my NiFi environments where we've got MarkLogic in play, even up through production. I just want a simple flow that will verify that NiFi can successfully talk to MarkLogic. I'm going to start by grabbing a process group and dragging that onto the canvas. A process group is the way we do subroutines in NiFi. It's a way of collecting some processors into a named group, very similar to how we would make a series of expressions encapsulated into a function in JavaScript or XQuery. So I'm going to call my process group MarkLogic connection test. Note that I can grab that processor group and move it around the canvas. I can also hold my left mouse button and move the canvas around, and that's changing my view without changing what's actually on the canvas. So we have our processor group. I'm going to double click on that to go into it. Having done that, notice in the lower left, I've got my breadcrumbs here. So the top level is the NiFi flow. Within that, I'm in a processor group called MarkLogic connection test. To start my flow, I'm going to grab a processor, drag it onto the canvas, and as I generally do to start my flows, I'm going to create a generate flow file processor. And then I'm going to grab another processor, drag it down below, filter for MarkLogic, and I'm going to run an execute script MarkLogic processor. I'll line those up. A helpful thing to know is that you can select multiple components in NiFi by holding down your Shift key and then clicking them. So this processor is already selected. I'm going to hold my Shift key, left click on this one. Now if I right click on one of these processors, I get a context menu that will apply to both of them. In this case, I'm going to align vertically. And that just gives me a nice flow here. I'd like to connect these two. Generate flow file does pretty much what it sounds like. It's going to create a new flow file and send that into a queue. So I'm going to take this arrow here, I'm going to drag it down to my execute script MarkLogic processor. That'll give me the opportunity to specify some settings for the queue that will now exist between these processors. I'm not going to make any changes here. I'm just going to click add. And you can see these two processors are now connected. I'm now going to add a couple of funnels. Funnels, they have a purpose other than this, but I often use them for simple no-op kinds of processors where I just want to have a queue that exists somewhere and I want to see what's in it. In this case, when the execute script MarkLogic processor does something, I'm interested in the results. So any results that come out of that will go into this queue. I'm also interested to know if anything goes wrong. If there's a failure, I'm interested in knowing that. These other relationships are not important for this flow. So I'm going to right-click here on the processor and go to Configure. I can also double-click on the processor to configure it. When I go to the Relationships tab, I'm going to tell this processor to terminate first, last, and original. What that means is that any flow files it would have sent to one of those relationships, I don't need, so it can just drop those flow files. I'll align these horizontally. Okay. You'll notice here that this processor has a red box indicating it is stopped. This one has a yellow triangle indicating that it's invalid. When we hover over it, we're given the reasons why this processor is currently invalid. Let's go configure this. I'm going to go to the properties. I'm going to skip this first one for the moment. So the execution type, I'll select JavaScript. What this processor does is run some code that you specify inside of MarkLogic. We can give it either the actual body, the actual code to run, or we can give it direction of where to find a module that it should run. So in this case, I'm just going to give it a body and say xdmp.version. In other words, MarkLogic, what version of MarkLogic are you? I'm going to click OK. It's going to write those results to content. We can also have it write them to an attribute or multiple attributes. Okay, we still have our triangle here because we've not yet specified the client service, the database client service. These processors will do some chunk of work. For any kind of processor that interacts with a database, something external like that, we're going to define a service which is going to cover things like where does that database exist? What credentials should be used to access it? Let's set that up for MarkLogic. Now, I need to create a new service, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to give it a name. I often name them something about the application that's being built, and for most applications, I would also include something about the environment, just as a visual reminder of where we are: dev, QA, production, etc. Okay, so now that service exists, but it's not configured. I can click on this arrow here to go to that service and configure it. We'll save the changes here in the processor first, and we'll go to the service. A number of key things need to be set here. Where is MarkLogic? What port should we interact with? And how will we authenticate? Now, I'm running all this in Docker on my laptop, so it might intuitively seem like we could go with localhost for this. But in fact, we cannot do that. The reason is that within the context of the Docker container running NiFi, localhost is just that Docker container. MarkLogic is running in a different container. So I need to find the IP address for that. To do that, I'm going to ask Docker, what is the IP address? The hostname -i command will give that to me. If you've used Docker Compose, then you'll get a set IP address, and you'll already know that. Be aware that if you're using multiple separate Docker containers like this, the order in which you start those containers will affect the IP address, so this could potentially change. So I'll put that in place. Port 8000 is fine for now. I have not deployed an application to the other MarkLogic instance. There's no load balancer in place. Digest is fine. I'm just going to go with my simple admin here. Notice that when I set the password, we get a sensitive value set reading here. There's no way in here to look and see the password, so NiFi treats that as secure information. I'm not going to specify the database. We'll just interact with the default one. That's fine. I would generally use the port of the application that I'm going to interact with. In this case, I'm going to stick with 8000 and just verify that I can talk to MarkLogic itself. Having configured the service, you'll note that it's still disabled. So I'm going to go to the lightning icon here and enable it. Okay, great. Got a check mark. I'm going to close this. Okay, so great. Now we've got a very simple flow that should allow us to test that that connection is valid. For generate flow file, I'm going to right click on it and select the run once command. When I do that, it's going to generate one single flow file. The user interface typically updates every 45 seconds. So I'm just going to right click on the canvas, the background, and hit refresh so that I can see the updates. And we'll see that I've got one flow file in this queue. Note that if I right click on this queue and go to list queue, I'll see all the flow files that are there. I'll be able to click on this I letter icon here, and that'll show me the content, the attributes, and some other interesting metadata about it. A flow file consists of attributes, some pieces of information stored in memory, and content, some information that is written to disk. So let's see if this works. Let's run once. And you'll notice this marker here, that simply is an indicator that the processor is running. It doesn't actually take that long, it's just not refreshing. So it got through, it's in the results queue, 6 bytes, that's the amount of content. I'll go to list queue again. I'll take a look at the icon, and we can see that my content now has something in it. If I view, I'm running MarkLogic 1102. Great. So my flow works. That tells me I've got a valid connection from NiFi to MarkLogic. Now, an important thing to recognize about this is scope. I mentioned that we've got the top level NiFi flow, and inside of that we have a processor group called MarkLogic Connection Test. Inside of MarkLogic Connection Test, I'll double click and go into it again. Let's right click on the canvas and go to configure. Here's where we see the controller services. Note the scope. The scope of my service is MarkLogic Connection Test. In other words, it's this processor group. That means that this connection, this service, will not be available to other flows that are outside of this group. If I want them to be available, what I need to do is create them at this level or in some other processor group. Having taken a quick look at that and run our simple flow, let's take a look at what we have. The queued information here, this is telling us how many flow files are currently in queues within this processor group or any of its children. We also have in and out, which tell us how many flow files have gone into this processor group or come out of it, and I'll demonstrate that in a future video. The 6 bytes is how much content is contained within the flow files. Let's go back into here for a second. For the individual processors, the in and out reflect how many flow files have gone into that processor or come out of that processor. In the case of generate flow file, the in number will always be 0 because it does not accept any inputs, it only creates outputs. These numbers are in the context of the last 5 minutes. So in the last 5 minutes, we can see the generate flow file has created one flow file. The execute script MarkLogic processor has had one flow file come in and one flow file go out. If we wait 5 minutes and refresh, these numbers will go to 0. Looking across the top, we can also see some summary information about the entire NiFi instance. This first icon tells us how many active threads there are. In other words, how many processors are actively running and doing active processing. This next number tells us about the queued data. How many flow files are there? Just one right now. And how much content do those flow files represent? Just 6 bytes. We don't do a whole lot of work with remote process groups at this stage, so I'm going to skip over those for now. This one shows us how many running processors we have across the entire instance, how many stopped processors, and they both happen to be right here in this group, how many are invalid, disabled, and then these few numbers indicate how in sync are things with NiFi registry. We'll talk about NiFi registry in a future video. To summarize, in this video we have set up a NiFi Docker container. We've added the MarkLogic components to it, and we've created a simple flow that verifies connectivity between NiFi and MarkLogic. Stay tuned for future videos.